The rope around Evangeline's wrists had left marks that would fade, but the shame burning in her chest would not. She stood in the center of the dusty courthouse square, while men circled her like vultures eyeing carrion, their voices a blur of numbers and cruel speculation. Her father had not even looked at her when he handed over the papers, his signature still wet with ink and desperation. $50, he had muttered. Enough to keep the bank from taking the farm. Enough to buy another season of hope. She was 22, unmarried, and according to the auctioneer's harsh proclamation, strong enough for field work and young enough to bear children. The crowd laughed when he added that last part, a sound like breaking glasses that cut through the October air. Evangeline kept her eyes fixed on a crack in the wooden platform beneath her feet, counting the grain lines to keep from crying. She had worn her mother's blue dress, the one with tiny flowers embroidered along the collar, thinking somehow it might make her look less like livestock. Now she realized it only made the humiliation sharper, more complete. A man with tobacco-stained teeth and hands that shook from too much whiskey called out a bid. $20. Another voice, higher, meaner, countered with 25. They were not bidding on a person, she told herself, just on the idea of one. On the labor her body could provide, the children she might produce, the silence she would maintain. But even that small comfort crumbled when she caught sight of Marcus Holloway standing near the back of the crowd, his arms crossed, and his mouth curved into a smile that made her skin crawl. Marcus owned the largest ranch in 3 counties and had a reputation for being particularly hard on his workers, and even harder on the women who worked in his kitchen. His bid, when it came, was $50. Spoken with the casual authority of a man who always got what he wanted. The auctioneer's gavel was halfway to the podium when another voice cut through the afternoon heat like a blade through silk. $100. The crowd turned as one, necks craning to see who had spoken. Evangeline lifted her head for the first time since stepping onto the platform and saw him. He stood apart from the others, tall and lean, with dark hair that caught the sunlight and clothes that spoke of wealth without ostentation. The brim of a black hat shadowed his face, but she could see his eyes, steady and unreadable, fixed not on the auctioneer but on her. There was something in his gaze that made her breath catch, not fear but recognition, as if he saw not what she had become, but what she had been before this moment stripped her bare. Marcus Holloway's face darkened, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. He raised his hand again, calling out, 125, his voice tight with anger. The stranger did not hesitate. 150. The number hung in the air like a challenge, and the crowd fell silent, sensing something had shifted, some current of power they could not quite name. Marcus took a step forward, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip, calling out, 175. The stranger's voice came again, calm and final. $200. Cash. He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch, the coins inside clinking softly as he held it up for all to see. The auctioneer's eyes went wide, and he looked around the crowd as if expecting someone to match the bid, but the silence stretched on, thick and heavy as summer honey. Marcus Holloway spat into the dust and turned away, his boots striking the ground with each angry step. The stranger walked forward, his movements unhurried, and placed the pouch on the auctioneer's table. As he untied the knot and spilled the coins onto the scarred wood, Evangeline caught a glimpse of his hands, long-fingered and unmarked by callus or scar. the hands of a man who had never known hard labor. The money counted out to exactly $200 in gold and silver, more than most people in Millbrook saw in a year. The auctioneer stammered through the legal formalities, his voice high with excitement. But Evangeline heard none of it. She was watching the stranger, waiting for him to look at her again, to give her some sign of what he intended, what he expected, what price she would be required to pay for this unexpected salvation. When he finally approached the platform, she saw that his eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He did not smile, nor did he speak. He simply extended his hand to help her down from the wooden stage. His touch was gentle, she noted with surprise, his palm warm and steady against her fingers. Only when her feet touched solid ground did he speak, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "My name is Daniel Thorne, and you are no longer for sale." The words should have brought relief, but instead they filled her with a different kind of fear. The fear of owing something she could never repay to a man she did not know. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask what he wanted from her, what bargain she had unknowingly entered. But he was already walking away, his long stride carrying him toward a black carriage that waited at the edge of the square. The driver, an older man with kind eyes and weathered hands, tipped his hat to her as Daniel opened the door. "After you, miss," Daniel said, and there was something in his voice that made it sound less like a command than a request. Evangeline looked back once at the crowd, at her father who still would not meet her eyes, at the platform where she had stood like merchandise waiting to be claimed. Then she gathered her skirts and stepped into the carriage, into the darkness that smelled of leather, uncertainty, and the faint scent of cedar. As the wheels began to turn and Millbrook fell away behind them, she realized she had traded one kind of bondage for another, but at least this cage was lined with velvet instead of iron. The carriage rolled through countryside she had never seen before, past fields of corn stubble and orchards heavy with late apples, past farmhouses that grew fewer and more grand as the miles stretched on. Danielle sat across from her in silence, his hat now resting on the seat beside him, revealing hair that was indeed dark, almost black, with threads of silver at the temples, suggesting he was older than she had first thought. His face was angular, all sharp lines and shadows, but not unkind. He did not stare at her, as Marcus Holloway would have done, did not let his gaze linger on the places her dress pulled tight across her chest, or the curve of her ankle where her shoe had worn through. Instead, he looked out the window at the passing landscape, his fingers drumming softly against his knee, in a rhythm she could not identify. When she could stand the silence no longer, Evangeline spoke. "Where are you taking me?" Her voice came out smaller than she had intended, barely above a whisper. Daniel turned from the window, those storm gray eyes focusing on her with an intensity that made her feel suddenly exposed. "To my home," he said. And then, as if reading the fear in her face, he added, "You will have your own room, your own key. You are free to leave at any time." She studied his face, looking for the lie beneath the words, but found only a weariness that seemed to run bone deep. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you pay so much for someone you do not know?" For a long moment he did not answer, his gaze returning to the window and the endless stretch of road ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to lean forward to hear him. "Because I know what it is to be sold, and I swore I would never let it happen to another if I had the power to stop it." The words hung between them like a bridge neither quite dared to cross, and Evangeline felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight band of fear that had been wrapped around her heart since morning. She wanted to ask what he meant, who had sold him, and for what price. But something in his posture warned her away from the question. Instead, she settled back against the velvet cushions and watched the world roll past, trying to imagine what kind of life awaited her in the house of a man who bought people only to set them free. The sun was setting when they finally turned through a pair of iron gates that stood open like welcoming arms. The drive was long and lined with oak trees, whose leaves had turned the color of fire in the dying light. At the end of it stood a house that took Evangeline's breath away, not because it was the largest she had ever seen, though it was grand enough, but because it looked like a home rather than a monument to wealth. It was built of red brick, with white columns that supported a wide front porch, and warm light spilled from every window like honey from a broken comb. As the carriage drew to a stop, the front door opened, and a woman emerged, her gray hair pinned neatly beneath a white cap, her dress a deep blue reminiscent of the evening sky. She moved down the steps with the easy confidence of someone who knew her place in the world and was content with it. And when she reached the carriage, she smiled at Evangeline with genuine warmth. "Welcome," she said, her voice carrying the soft accent of the mountain people. "I'm Mrs. Hartwell, and I keep house for Mr. Thorne. We have been expecting you." Daniel stepped down from the carriage and offered Evangeline his hand again, and this time she took it without hesitation. Surprised by how natural the gesture felt, Mrs. Hartwell led them up the front steps and into a hallway that smelled of beeswax and roses, its walls lined with the portraits of people Evangeline did not recognize, but who seemed to be watching her with curious eyes. "Your room is this way, dear," Mrs. Hartwell said, guiding her up a curved staircase that felt like something from a fairy tale. Daniel followed behind him, his footsteps quiet on the polished wood. The room Mrs. Hartwell showed her was larger than the entire cabin where Evangeline had grown up, with a bed big enough for 3 people and windows that looked out over gardens, even in the twilight, which she could see were lovingly tended. There was a writing desk with paper and ink, a wardrobe that stood open to reveal dresses in colors she had only dreamed of, and in the corner, a chair upholstered in silk that looked like it had never been sat in. "This is yours," Daniel said from the doorway, and when she turned to look at him, she saw that he was holding a small iron key. "For the door," he explained. "I meant what I said in the carriage. You are free to come and go as you please." Evangeline took the key, its weight solid and real in her palm, and for the first time since morning, she felt the tight knot in her chest begin to loosen. "Mrs. Hartwell will show you where everything is," Daniel continued. "Supper is at 7, but please don't feel obligated to join us if you would rather rest. Tomorrow we can discuss what you would like to do, whether you wish to stay or if you would prefer I arrange his passage somewhere else." He paused, and something flickered across his face, too quick for her to catch. "The choice is yours, Evangeline. It always will be." After they left her alone, Evangeline stood at the window and watched the last light fade from the sky, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. She thought of her father counting out the money Daniel Thorne had paid, of Marcus Holloway's angry face, of the crowd that had bid on her like she was a prize sow issue at the county fair. Then she looked around the beautiful room that was somehow hers, at the key that meant she could lock the world out or let it in as she chose. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, her story was not ending, but beginning. That first night, Evangeline did not sleep. She sat in the silk chair by the window and watched the stars wheel slowly across the sky, afraid that if she closed her eyes, she would wake to find it all a dream, that she would be back on the platform with rope around her wrists and Marcus Holloway's cruel smile waiting for her. When dawn finally came, painting the eastern sky the color of rose petals, she heard soft footsteps in the hallway outside her door, followed by a gentle knock. "Come in," she called, and Mrs. Hartwell entered carrying a tray that smelled of coffee and fresh bread. "Good morning, dear," the older woman said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "I thought you might be hungry." Evangeline realized she was famished. She had not eaten since the night before, too nervous to keep anything down. The bread was still warm from the oven and spread thick with butter and honey, and the coffee was stronger and richer than anything she had ever tasted. As she ate, Mrs. Hartwell busied herself about the room, straightening things that did not need straightening, and Evangeline sensed the woman wanted to talk but was waiting for permission. "Tell me about him," Evangeline said finally. "About Mr. Thorne." Mrs. Hartwell paused in her dusting and looked at her with eyes that held both kindness and caution. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," Evangeline said. "Why did he buy me? Why does he live alone in this big house? Why does he look at me like he sees something I do not know is there?" Mrs. Hartwell sat down in the chair across from her, folding her hands in her lap. "Mr. Daniel is a good man," she began, "but he has not had an easy life. His father made his fortune in shipping and built this house for Daniel's mother when they were young and full of dreams. But dreams do not always survive the weight of reality." She paused, her eyes distant. Daniel was supposed to marry a girl his father chose, a girl from a wealthy family who would have been good for business. But Daniel fell in love with someone else, a servant girl who worked in his father's house. When his father discovered the relationship, he sold the girl to a family in California, telling Daniel she had run away with another man. By the time Daniel learned the truth, she was gone, and he never saw her again. Evangeline felt something cold settle in her stomach. What happened then? "His father died 3 years ago," Mrs. Hartwell continued. "Left Daniel everything, but also left him with the knowledge of what money can do to people, how it can turn love into commerce, how it can make human beings into property. He has been trying to make amends ever since, in his own way." She looked directly at Evangeline. "Yesterday was not the first time he has intervened at an auction, though it was the first time he brought someone home. Usually, he just pays their debts and sends them on their way with enough money to start over. But something about you was different." "What?" Evangeline whispered. Mrs. Hartwell smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "That is a question you will have to ask him yourself, dear. But I will say this. In the 3 years I have worked for him, I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you yesterday." After Mrs. Hartwell left, Evangeline bathed in the copper tub that the housekeeper had filled with hot water, scented with lavender, then dressed in one of the gowns from the wardrobe, a simple dress of green wool that fit her as if it had been made to her exact measurements. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. Gone was the frightened girl in the faded blue dress. In her place stood someone who looked like she belonged in this house, in this life that felt too good to be real. She found Daniel in the library, a room lined floor to ceiling with more books than she had ever seen in one place. He was sitting behind a massive desk, papers spread before him, but he looked up when she entered and rose to his feet with the automatic courtesy of a man raised to mind his manners. "Good morning," he said. "I trust you slept well." She almost laughed at the polite fiction. "Not at all," she admitted. "I was afraid I would wake up and find myself back home." He nodded as if he understood perfectly. "Mrs. Hartwell tells me she has explained some of my history. I hope it helps you understand why I did what I did yesterday. It was not an impulse or charity. It was a necessity." Evangeline walked closer to the desk, noting how the morning light caught the silver in his dark hair, how his hands rested carefully on the papers as if he were afraid of crumpling them. She could see now that he was perhaps 35, old enough to have lived through disappointment, but young enough to still hope for something better. "I need to know what you expect from me," she said, proud that her voice was steady. "No one pays $200 without expecting something in return." Daniel was quiet for so long she wondered if he had heard her. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. "I expect nothing," he said, "but I would like to offer you something, if you were interested." He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and she sat down, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled only slightly. "I have been thinking of hiring a companion for Mrs. Hartwell, someone to help her with the household management and perhaps assist me with correspondence. The position would come with the salary, of course, and you would be free to leave at any time if you found something that suited you better. It is honest work, with honest pay, and no obligations beyond what any employee might have." Evangeline studied his face, looking for the trap hidden in the generous offer. What if I said no? What if I wanted to leave today? "Then I would give you money for travel and wish you well," he said without hesitation. "The choice is yours, Evangeline. It always will be." There was something in the way he said her name that made her heart skip, a tenderness that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. She thought of Marcus Holloway's crude hands and cruder words, of her father's refusal to meet her eyes as he signed the papers that sold her freedom, of the crowd that had bid on her like she was something to be owned rather than someone to be cherished. Then she looked at Daniel Thorne, at the loneliness that shadowed his eyes, and the careful distance he maintained even as she sensed his desire to close the space between them. "I would like to try," she said, "if you think I would be suitable." A smile touched the corners of his mouth, the first real smile she had seen from him. "I think," he said, "you would be more than suitable." And for the first time since she had stepped onto that auction platform, Evangeline began to believe that her future might be something worth looking forward to after all. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and natural to Evangeline. Each morning she woke in the beautiful room that was somehow hers, dressed in clothes finer than any she had ever owned, and went downstairs to help Mrs. Hartwell plan the day's activities. The older woman taught her how to manage a household of servants, how to plan menus, and oversee the endless tasks that kept a large house running smoothly. In the afternoon, she worked with Daniel on his correspondence, copying letters in her careful script and helping him organize the papers that seemed to multiply on his desk like flowers after rain. She learned that he owned not just the shipping business his father had built, but also several smaller enterprises, a lumber mill, 2 general stores, and a small bank that specialized in loans to people who could not get credit elsewhere. He worked constantly, she noticed, as if movement and purpose were the only things that kept his demons at bay. They spoke little during these working hours, but she was aware of him always, of the way he held his pen, of the small frown that appeared between his brows when he was concentrating, of the habit he had of running his hand through his hair when he was frustrated. Sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, one that was part gratitude, part longing, and part fear. She wanted to ask him about the servant girl Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned, about the love his father had destroyed, so hidden, and whether its ghost still haunted the halls of this house. But something in his manner warned her away from such questions, and she contented herself with learning the smaller details of his life. That he took his coffee black, that he preferred his correspondence answered promptly, that he never spoke harshly to the servants and always remembered their names and the names of their children. It was during her third week in the house that she encountered Thomas, the groundskeeper, working in the garden behind the kitchen. He was an old man, bent with age and arthritis, struggling to dig up the last of the summer vegetables before the first frost could claim them. Without thinking, Evangeline rolled up her sleeves and knelt beside him in the dirt, her hands finding the familiar rhythm of work that had once been her daily bread. "Begging your pardon, miss," Thomas said, his voice tight with embarrassment, "but you should not be doing this. You are a lady now." Evangeline laughed, the sound surprising them both. "I may be wearing a lady's dress," she said, "but my hands remember how to work. Besides, these carrots will not harvest themselves." They worked together in comfortable silence, and when Daniel found them there an hour later, both covered with soil and laughing over Thomas's story about a raccoon that had been stealing apples from the orchard, something in his face shifted. He stood at the edge of the garden watching them, and when Evangeline looked up and saw him there, she felt heat rise in her cheeks at the thought of how she must look, dirty and disheveled, and happy in a way she had almost forgotten how to be. "You are full of surprises," he said, but his voice was warm rather than critical. Thomas struggled to his feet, brushing dirt from his knees. "I am sorry, Mr. Daniel," he began, but Daniel waved away his apology. "There is no shame in honest work, Thomas," he said, "and no shame in helping a friend." That evening, as they worked together in the library, Daniel seemed different, more relaxed somehow, as if seeing her with her hands in the earth had answered some question he had been afraid to ask. "I grew up on a farm," Evangeline said, though he had not asked, "before my father lost everything to bad investments and worse luck. I know what it is to work for my supper." Danielle set down his pen and looked at her directly. "Is that what you think of this arrangement? That you are working for your supper?" The question caught her off guard, and she felt something flutter in her chest like a bird testing its wings. "I do not know what to think," she admitted. "You paid a great deal of money for me, and now you give me beautiful clothes and ask nothing in return. It does not feel real. It feels like a dream. I will wake from it any moment." Daniel was quiet for a long time, his fingers drumming against the desk in that rhythm she had come to recognize as his thinking pattern. Then he rose from his chair and walked to the window that looked out over the gardens where they had worked that afternoon. "I told you my father sold the woman I loved," he said, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. "What I did not tell you is that I have spent the last 3 years trying to find her, to make amends for what was done in my name. I have traced her to California, to Oregon, to a dozen different cities and towns, but the trail always goes cold. She might be dead, or married, or simply living under a different name where I will never find her." He turned back to face her. and in his eyes she saw a pain so deep it made her chest ache. I bought you because I could not bear to see another woman sold like property. Because I could not save Rebecca, but I could save you. But somewhere between the auction block and this moment, something changed. You stopped being a stranger I was trying to help and became someone I was trying to keep. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Evangeline felt her heart beating so hard that she was sure he must hear it. She felt the careful walls she had built around her feelings begin to crumble like sand castles before the tide. "What are you saying?" she whispered. Daniel took a step toward her, then stopped as if remembering himself. "I'm saying that I think I am falling in love with you," he said, "and I am terrified that you will think it is because I own you, because of the money I paid and the debt you think you owe. I am terrified that you will never be able to see me as anything other than the man who bought you, even if his intentions were good." Evangeline rose from her chair, her legs unsteady beneath her. The space between them felt charged with possibility and danger, with all the words they had not spoken and all the touches they had not shared. "You do not own me," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "You said so yourself, the day you gave me the key. The choice is mine." Daniel's eyes searched her face as if trying to read her thoughts. "And what choice do you make?" he asked. Instead of answering with words, Evangeline closed the distance between them, her heart hammering as she reached out to touch his face with fingers that trembled like autumn leaves. His skin was warm beneath her palm, rough with the stubble of evening, and when he leaned into her touch, she felt something inside her break open like a flower blooming in unexpected sunshine. "I choose you," she whispered. "Not because I owe you anything, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because you make me feel like I am worth choosing in return." When he kissed her, it was with the desperate tenderness of a man who had given up hope and then found it again in the most unlikely place. And for the first time since she had stepped onto that auction platform, Evangeline felt truly free. The winter that followed was the gentlest of Evangeline's life, wrapped as she was in the warmth of Danielle's love and the security of her place in his household. Snow fell early and often, blanketing the grounds in pristine white that made the house feel like something from a fairy tale. She and Daniel were married in December. A quiet ceremony in the front parlor with only Mrs. Hartwell and Thomas as witnesses. Though there were no crowds or elaborate celebrations, Evangeline had never felt more cherished than when Daniel slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger and promised to love her until his last breath. But happiness, she learned, made some people generous, while others became bitter. The news of their marriage spread through the county like wildfire, and with it came whispers and speculation that cut deeper than any blade. She heard them when she went to town for supplies, saw them in the eyes of women who had once bid her good morning with Christian charity. "There goes Danielle Thorne's bought bride," they said. "Wonder how long it will be before he tires of his fancy purchase and goes looking for fresher merchandise." The words followed her home and nested in her heart like thorns, making her question every kiss, every gentle touch, every moment of contentment. Was she truly his wife, or was she simply a more convenient arrangement than the previous one? Had he married her out of love or guilt, or some complicated mixture of both that she would never fully understand? The doubts grew stronger when Marcus Holloway began making his presence known around the county. He had not forgiven Daniel for outbidding him at the auction, and his wounded pride festered like an untreated wound. He spread stories about Danielle's business practices suggesting that a man who bought women at auction could not be trusted with other people's money. He made pointed comments about the sanctity of marriage and the proper order of society, always with Evangeline's name on his lips, as if it were a curse. The situation came to a head on a February morning when Daniel returned from town with his jaw set and his eyes blazing with an anger she had never seen before. Marcus Holloway had confronted him outside the bank, demanding satisfaction for what he called an insult to his honor and his manhood. There would be a formal challenge, Danielle told her as they sat before the fire that evening, his hands gripping hers so tightly she could feel the tremor in his fingers. A duel with pistols at dawn. Evangeline felt the blood drain from her face. "You cannot be serious," she whispered. "It is 1847, not 1747. People do not settle disputes with gunfire anymore." "Tell that to Marcus Holloway," Danielle said grimly. "He has made it clear that he will not let this matter rest until one of us is dead, or he has what he considers proper recompense for his wounded dignity." "And what does he consider proper recompense?" Evangeline asked, though she already knew the answer. "You," Danielle said simply. "He wants you returned to him, wants our marriage annulled, wants you to fulfill what he sees as your proper destiny as his property." Evangeline pulled her hands free from his and rose from her chair, pacing to the window where she could see snow falling like tears against the glass. "I will not be the cause of your death," she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "If he wants me that badly, perhaps it would be better if I simply disappeared, went somewhere far away, where neither of you could find me." Daniel was behind her in an instant, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against the solid warmth of his chest. "Do not even think such a thing," he said fiercely. "I would rather die than lose you, would rather face a dozen Marcus Holloways than live without you for a single day." "But what if you do die?" she asked, turning in his arms to face him. "What if his aim is better than yours? What if I wake up tomorrow as a widow instead of a wife? Then you will know that I died protecting what I love most in this world," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "And you will live, Evangeline. You will live free and happy and loved, because that is what I want for you more than anything else." They held each other that night as if it might be their last time, and when dawn came gray and cold, Evangeline stood at the bedroom window and watched Daniel walk across the snow-covered field to where Marcus Holloway waited with his seconds and his pistols and his righteous fury. The distance was too great for her to see their faces clearly, but she could imagine the scene playing out like something from a Gothic novel. Two men facing each other across 20 paces, their breath clouding in the frigid air. There, lives hanging in the balance over a woman's honor and a wounded man's pride. She heard the shots, two sharp cracks that echoed across the valley like thunder, and then silence that stretched on forever. When Daniel finally appeared on the horizon, walking slowly but steadily toward the house, Evangeline sank to her knees and wept with relief. Marcus Holloway's shot had gone wide, Daniel told her later, as Mrs. Hartwell tended to the shallow graze on his left arm. His own bullet had found its mark in the other man's shoulder, enough to satisfy honor without taking a life. The matter was closed, Marcus had been forced to admit, his pride assuaged by the blood that had been shed and his desire for revenge cooled by his brush with mortality. But even as Daniel held her and promised that they were safe, that no one would ever threaten their happiness again, Evangeline could not shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. Love she was learning was not just about the moments of joy and passion, but about the strength to face whatever darkness tried to tear it apart. In a world where women could still be sold like livestock and men could still kill each other over matters of honor, there would always be new challenges to test the bonds they had forged in the crucible of an unexpected beginning. Spring came to the Thorn estate like a benediction, bringing with it the promise of new life and the healing that only time and love can provide. The gardens burst into bloom with a profusion of color that made Evangeline's heart sing every time she walked among the flower beds. She spent her mornings there with Thomas, planting new plantings and learning the names of roses that had been tended by Danielle's mother years before. The duel with Marcus Holloway had changed something in the county's perception of their marriage. Whether it was the blood that had been shed or simply the passage of time, the whispers began to fade, replaced by grudging respect for the woman who had stood by her husband through scandal and supported him through danger. Invitations began arriving for dinner parties and social gatherings, though Evangeline remained wary of the society that had once judged her so harshly. She found herself slowly making friends among the wives of Danielle's business associates. It was during one such gathering that she met Eleanor Whitmore, the wife of the county's leading physician, and a woman whose intelligence and kindness reminded Evangeline of Mrs. Hartwell. Eleanor had been watching her throughout the evening with curious eyes, and when they finally had a moment to speak privately, her first words surprised Evangeline with their directness. "I have been wanting to meet the woman who captured Daniel Thorne's heart," Eleanor said with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. "He has been alone for so long, and we had all given up hope that he would find happiness again." Evangeline felt heat rise in her cheeks at the frank assessment. "I fear my story is not the sort that polite society usually approves of," she said carefully. Eleanor laughed. They sounded like silver bells in the evening air. "My dear girl," she said, "I was born in a brothel in New Orleans and sold to my first husband when I was 16. I learned long ago that a woman's past matters far less than her present character and future intentions. After that, the two women became fast friends, and through Eleanor, Evangeline began to understand that she was not the only woman in their circle who had risen above difficult beginnings. There was something liberating in this knowledge, a sense that she belonged not in spite of her history, but because of the strength it had given her. As summer deepened into autumn, Evangeline began to notice changes in her own body that filled her with equal measures of joy and terror. Her monthly courses had stopped, her breasts had grown tender, and there was a new fullness to her figure that made her existing dresses uncomfortably tight. When she finally worked up the courage to share her suspicions with Daniel, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her up in his arms and spun her around the library until they were both dizzy with laughter, then set her down gently and kissed her with a reverence that made her feel like the most precious thing in his world. But beneath her happiness, fear lurked like a shadow at the edge of her consciousness. She thought of the 7 tiny graves that Danielle's first wife had filled with her broken dreams, of the pain that had consumed them both until there was nothing left but ash and memory. What if she, too, was destined to fail at the most fundamental task of womanhood? What if her body, which had already disappointed one man, would disappoint Daniel as well? These fears grew stronger as the weeks passed, and her condition became more apparent. Mrs. Hartwell fussed over her like a mother hen. bringing her special teas and delicate foods designed to strengthen both mother and child. Daniel treated her like spun glass, hovering protectively and insisting she avoid any activity that might be considered even remotely strenuous. But it was Eleanor Whitmore who provided the wisdom that Evangeline most needed to hear. Every woman's body is different, Eleanor told her during one of their afternoon visits. What happened to Danielle's first wife does not dictate what will happen to you. You are young, strong, and healthy, and you have every reason to expect a successful delivery. When Evangeline confessed her deeper fears, Eleanor's expression grew serious. You are afraid that if you lose this child, you will lose Danielle as well, she said. But love that depends on a woman's ability to bear children is not love at all. It is a transaction. Danielle chose you before he knew you carried his child. And he will choose you still, no matter what comes. The winter months passed slowly, Evangeline's body growing round and heavy with the promise of new life. Danielle read to her in the evenings from books of poetry and adventure. His voice, a soothing balm against the aches and fears that plagued her nights. Mrs. Hartwell knitted tiny garments with fingers that remembered the joy of preparing for babies that would actually draw a breath, and Thomas built a cradle from cherry wood that gleamed like honey in the firelight. When the pains began on a February morning, with snow falling thick outside the windows, Evangeline felt a terror so complete it stole her breath. But Eleanor and her husband, the local physician, arrived within the hour, his medical bag in hand and his voice steady with professional calm. Eleanor, his wife, acted as midwife, and Mrs. Hartwell stood ready with clean linens and boiling water. Daniel paced the hallway outside their bedroom like a caged wolf, starting at every cry that escaped through the heavy door. The labor was long and difficult, stretching through the day and into the night. But when the final moment came, and Eleanor placed a squalling, red-faced infant into Evangeline's arms, the room filled with a joy so pure it seemed to drive out every shadow that had ever darkened their lives. "It's a boy," Eleanor announced with tears streaming down her cheeks. "A beautiful, perfect boy." Daniel entered the room with reverent steps, his eyes wide with wonder as he looked down at his son. The baby had dark hair like his father's, and eyes that seemed to take in everything with curious intelligence. When Daniel reached out to touch the tiny fist that waved in the air, the infant's fingers closed around his thumb with surprising strength, and something in Daniel's face broke open like sunrise after the longest night. "What should we call him?" Evangeline whispered, exhausted but radiant with happiness. Daniel looked at her, then at their son, then at the window where dawn was beginning to paint the sky with soft gold. "Thomas," he said, "after the man who taught us both that there is no shame in honest work, that love grows best in soil tended by patient hands." "Thomas Danielle Thorne," Evangeline agreed, pressing her lips to the baby's downy head. "Our miracle." And as the first light of their son's first day spilled across the room where love had conquered every obstacle placed in his path, Evangeline knew that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the darkest moments, that sometimes being sold can lead to being chosen, and that sometimes a stranger's intervention can become the foundation for a lifetime of joy. The boy who had been born from a love that defied society's rules would grow up knowing he was wanted, knowing he was cherished, knowing that his parents had fought for their right to love each other, and would fight just as fiercely for his right to become whatever his heart called him to be. In a world where children were often seen as burdens or bargains, Thomas Thorne would be raised as a blessing, proof that love could indeed conquer all. If this tale of unexpected love born from the darkest of circumstances touched your heart, if you believe that even in the harshest frontier towns, true love can bloom where least expected, then you've found your home with Maverick Hearts. Here we bring you more than just romance. We bring you the raw truth of survival, the quiet strength of those who refuse to be broken, and the kind of love that rises from ashes to build something beautiful and lasting. If stories like this one stir something profound in your soul, if you hunger for more tales of redemption on the untamed frontier, make sure to show this story some love with a like. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss another journey into the wild heart of the American West, where love was hard won, but worth fighting for. And don't forget to hit that notification bell, because every week we're bringing you new stories of courage, passion, and the unbreakable human spirit that tamed a continent one heart at a time.